Hey guys, it's Randy with Lowbuck LS here again, and this week we're going to talk about power adders for your LS engine. We're going to compare turbos versus superchargers versus nitrous. And this week it's going to be a dual purpose episode. This one's going to go out as a video on the YouTube channel and up as an episode of the podcast as well. So if you guys don't know, I've started a podcast as well called the Lowbuck LS Podcast. And like my YouTube channel, it's all about getting affordable horsepower out of these LS engines. So if you listen to podcasts, go check it out. It's on Spotify right now and should be up shortly on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, let's talk about power adders for your LS. So as you can probably guess, I'm a little bit biased. I'm definitely a turbo guy. And I don't actually have any hands-on experience with superchargers or nitrous. Although I do want to experiment with those kinds of power adders at some point in the future. Right now, I'm a turbo guy, and it looks like a lot of you guys are in the same camp as me. I did a poll in the Lowbuck LS Facebook group, and you should join us there, by the way. If you're not a member already, I'll put a link in the description or the show notes of the podcast. But I asked the guys in that group what kind of power adder they ran, and 32 guys voted, and I wrote down the results here. 16 of them, or 50%, were running a turbo, like myself. 9 guys were NA, so 28%, had no power adder at all. 3 guys had superchargers, so 9%. 2 guys were nitrous guys, and 2 guys ran nitrous with their turbos, and some guys will do that, run a small shot of nitrous in combination with their turbo just to get it spooled up quicker, like a 35 or 50 horse shot. So 2 guys in the group were in that camp, but yeah, turbos were by far half of the guys who voted were turbo guys like me. So let's talk about turbos first. So here are some of the pros of putting a turbo on your LS engine. The horsepower potential is the big draw for me. Like the bang for the buck or the horsepower for dollar is pretty well unbeatable. Like you'll get the most amount of horsepower for the smallest amount of money. The only power adder that might be comparable in terms of bang for buck would be nitrous, but still in ultimate power potential, the turbo still has the win over nitrous. So that's the main reason I'm a turbo guy. Another benefit of a turbo is they're more efficient than a supercharger. It's not free horsepower. Like you'll still, especially like me, I'm running the VS Racing 7875 turbo, which has the T4 turbine housing. So when you start getting into higher boost levels, back pressure can become an issue. So it's not free horsepower. Running that turbo can create back pressure, which basically robs horsepower from your engine. But it's still more efficient than a supercharger. Those superchargers it's like a big air compressor, so it takes a lot more horsepower away from the crankshaft to turn that supercharger over. Another benefit of the turbo is there's no bottle to fill. If you're a nitrous guy, you've always got to be filling up your bottle, but with a turbo, basically once you've paid for it, that's it. You don't have to keep paying to fill the bottle every weekend you go to the strip or whatever. You might have to pay for a 4L60E now and then, but don't have to refill your nitrous bottle anyways. It's cheaper than supercharging, or at least the cost can be spread out a bit more. With a supercharger, you kind of have to shell out a few $1,000s and buy like a ProCharger kit or a Torque Storm kit or a Magnuson or whatever your brand of choice is. With a turbo, you might end up paying almost as much in the long run, but for me, I bought the turbo first and then bought the manifolds and kind of pieced the system together as I went. So I didn't have to shell out thousands of dollars all at once. It was more like 500 here, 500 there type of thing. Another advantage of the turbo is boost control. In my mind, is easier than on a supercharger. A lot of superchargers, in order to change the boost level, you need to change the pulleys, which changes the speed that the supercharger is driven at. So it's not quite as convenient as a turbo where you can just adjust your boost control. I know some of the newer superchargers like the Magnusons and the LSAs or cars that have the Eaton supercharger have like a bypass valve, but then you need the ECU and the computer controls to go along with that. And I know I've seen some guys run like a wastegate on their supercharger, which probably works, but I still think boost control is simpler on a turbo than on a supercharger. But despite that big potential for horsepower and the big bang for the buck, turbos do have some fairly significant disadvantages, so we'll talk about those now. For me, the biggest disadvantage and the one thing I hate about this turbo truck behind me is they're finicky, like especially if you're running the stock ECU and tuning it with HP tuners, and running the manifolds I'm running and stuff, the hooker cast manifolds for the turbo. There's no spot for the narrowband O2 sensors that came with the truck from the factory. So that means it can't run in closed loop operation, which means it's basically you're running off your VE table. So your tune is usually not going to be perfect, and I'm noticing when I'll get my VE table dialed in so my AFR is bang on one weekend, and then the next weekend the temperature will have gone up 10 degrees or dropped 10 degrees, and I'll have to get out the laptop again and have to make some adjustments to the tune. So always seems like I'm reaching for the laptop and making adjustments to the tune as the temperature changes. The way around that would be to run that Holley Terminator X, so that's fairly high on my list of stuff I'd like to install on this truck, and that can do closed loop control off of your wideband O2 sensor, and it can also do closed loop control at wide open throttle, which your stock ECU can't do, even if you do still have the factory O2 sensors. Another disadvantage of the turbo system is your maintenance will be increased a little bit because your oil is circulating through the turbo as well, and it gets super hot and dirty and stuff like that. Probably have to do your oil changes a little more often and just keep up a little better on the maintenance of your vehicle. Another big downside is installing a turbo system is a lot of work. You either got to shell out big bucks and get a bolt-on turbo kit, which will be like $5,000 or $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000, which kind of negates the bang for the buck argument to the turbo, or you've got to do a lot of fabricating and rip out your exhaust system and either build log manifolds from scratch, or like I went with those hooker cast turbo manifolds, but even with those I had to modify the one motor mount because it didn't clear, and then you've got to fabricate the part from the manifolds to the turbo and the downpipe coming off of the turbo, and find a place for the wastegate and stuff like that. So there is quite a bit of fabricating and quite a bit of work involved with installing a turbo system, more work than a supercharger or nitrous. Another downside, depending on which manifolds you're running, with these hooker manifolds I've got, you've got to get rid of the air conditioning. So I know there are like that Falair Speed, Joey Falair makes cast manifolds, and I think Trick Performance, and there's a few other guys out there that make log manifolds that you can keep your air conditioning, but mine you can't. So that's another advantage of the Supercharger or nitrous. You get to keep your air conditioning in most cases. Which kind of ties into another downfall of the turbo system is they create a ton of heat underneath the hood, and even if you put a blanket, insulating blanket around your turbo and put that heat wrap around your exhaust and your manifolds and stuff, it's still going to create way more heat under the hood than a supercharger or nitrous will. And if you've got rid of your air conditioning, a lot of that heat transfers back into the cab, so it can make for a pretty hot ride if you're cruising around in your turbo vehicle with no air conditioning on a hot day in the summertime. Another downside that is a possibility, depending on the sizing of your turbo and the way the system is designed, is turbo lag. And that's not a huge problem like on this 78-75 turbo I'm running. It's a small turbine, so it spools up fairly quickly, but you're still below a certain RPM, you're not going to get much boost out of that turbo, and it's definitely doesn't have the low end torque that a supercharger or nitrous can provide. It almost feels like a two-stroke dirt bike. Like at lower RPMs, you're not making a whole bunch of power, and then you can feel it kind of get into the power band, and she starts pulling hard. Now let's talk about superchargers or blowers, and for the most part I'm talking about like guys on trucks like mine are going to be going with a Procharger or those new Torque Storm superchargers. So the big advantage with a supercharger is they've got a ton of low end torque, and it's instantaneous when you hit the throttle. You can fry your tires at will pretty much. So they do have for a fun street vehicle, it's pretty fun to be able to just put your foot into it and smoke the tires anytime you want to. So if you go back to the dirt bike analogy where the turbo feels like a 250 two-stroke, like a CR250, a supercharger probably feels more like a big 450 four-stroke dirt bike where you can roll into the throttle at any RPM and you've got tons of torque at your disposal. Another advantage of the supercharger is there's a lot less fabrication required. You usually just buy it in a bolt-on kit that has all the brackets and bolts and charge tube and all of that. So it's a less complicated install and quicker to install than a turbo system. Another advantage is you don't have to modify your exhaust system, so your factory O2 sensors and all of your exhaust can stay the same. That means you keep that closed loop operation for your stock ECU, and your truck will need a lot less tuning, and you won't have to pick up your laptop as often, in my opinion, with a supercharged vehicle. And that's another thing I wanted to mention is all of this is kind of up for debate, and a lot of this is my opinion. So in any of these videos, if you see me say something that's not correct, make sure to point it out. I want these videos to be as accurate and as correct as possible. And if you disagree, post in the comments, or if you're listening to the podcast, shoot me an email at randy@lowbuckls.com, and let's have a discussion about it. And just like a turbo, with a supercharger, your nitrous bottle is never going to run out. So again, you kind of pay your money up front and pay it all once, and then you don't have to keep filling your bottle to keep enjoying your extra horsepower. So even though a supercharger isn't capable of putting out quite as much horsepower as a turbo, it's still going to put out tons of horsepower for the average guy. Like it'll put out enough to the limitation isn't going to be your supercharger, it's probably going to be the rods of your Gen 3 truck engine. Now let's talk about the downsides of superchargers. The biggest one for me, and why I don't currently have a supercharger, is the cost. Like I mentioned before, if you want to buy a supercharger kit, you've got to scrape together a few $1,000s and lay it down all at once. And I'm not very good at scraping together a few $1,000s, so that's probably one of the reasons I'm a turbo guy. And like I mentioned before, superchargers aren't as efficient as a turbo, and especially when you get into the higher boost levels. Most of these superchargers are belt driven, so as the load gets higher, you can start having belt slip. And I think Procharger does make a gear driven supercharger, but then that's even more expensive, and you got to shell out more dollars for that. And like I mentioned before, boost control is a little trickier on the supercharger. Like I said, there's a few different methods that you can control boost with a supercharger, but generally I just think it's simpler on a turbo. Now let's talk about nitrous. So nitrous is actually pretty tempting to me, and I think at some point in the not too distant future on the channel, I'd like to do some experimenting with nitrous. For me, the big draws for it are it's fairly cheap and simple to install. It's not like a turbo where you've got to rip out the exhaust system and do a whole bunch of fabrication and complicated install, like you install a bottle and a plate or and some lines and solenoids, and it's fairly quick and simple and relatively cheap to install. Like I mentioned, you can use it to complement other power adders. Like there's a couple guys in the group that use it to help their turbos spool up quicker. Like a supercharger, your torque increase is instantaneous, and that can also kind of create a few problems every now and then, but you can get that torque boost wherever you want it. As soon as you push the button, you've got that extra torque. And like with a supercharger, you're keeping your exhaust system the same, so your narrowband O2s are in the same, so you get to keep that closed loop operation from your stock ECU. But one thing, at wide open throttle, your stock ECU isn't going to be capable of doing closed loop control at wide open throttle, so it's not a huge benefit at wide open throttle, but when you're cruising around on the street at part throttle, your tune will basically be dead on, because those narrowband O2 analyzers will always be adjusting your short-term fuel trims and long-term fuel trims and keep your AFR exactly where it's supposed to be. Now let's talk about the cons of nitrous. The big one is it's got a reputation for being hard on parts, but I think that's when guys bring it on at too low of an RPM and too big of a shot. It puts a big strain on your connecting rods and crank and pistons and stuff like that. So you've got to be a little more careful. And I know some guys are using like a progressive nitrous controller that brings it in, ramps it in gently. So that makes good sense to me, that you're not giving it that big hit, that big shot of extra torque that's going to be hard on parts. Another downside is, although the kit is relatively cheap and simple to install, you've got to get that bottle filled every weekend or every time you go out. And depending on where you are in the country or where you are in North America or the world, I guess, that can be expensive. I know Robert with Bad Luck Garage, he was saying he's paying $5 or $6 a pound, so $50 or $60 to fill a 10-pound bottle. But around here, guys are saying they're paying like $11 a pound, so over $100 to fill a 10-pound bottle. That's probably going to last you a Saturday or whatever. So it does, you don't have that initial where you've got to shell out a bunch of money, but you've still got to shell out $100 every weekend you want to go race with your nitrous. So you don't pay as much money up front, but you keep paying money every weekend, kind of thing. And then you've got to be satisfied that when the bottle runs out, the fun's over, kind of deal. So, and I have even heard that there have been like nitrous shortages in certain areas of the country and stuff like that, so it may or may not be available at certain times. So basically, to sum it up, a turbo system might be for you if you want maximum horsepower for your dollar. You don't mind doing a lot of work, which might include welding and fabrication and getting your hands dirty to install the turbo, and it's going to take longer, and it's not going to be a one-day install to put in your turbo. And if you want the maximum bang for your buck, maximum horsepower per dollar, I still think a turbo is the way to go. If you don't mind doing a little extra maintenance and changing your oil a little more often, and if you don't mind picking up the laptop relatively often and having to adjust your tune as the weather changes, since you don't have those factory O2 sensors for your closed loop operation, then a turbo might be for you. And a supercharger might be for you if you've got a few $1,000s to drop on a kit and you want something that doesn't take as much fabrication to install. All the brackets and parts and pieces are pretty much bolt on, and you want a quicker install and don't want to do much fabricating. If you're not looking for more than about 800 to 1,000-ish horsepower, and if you're okay with having to change pulleys to adjust your boost level or implement a little more complicated method of boost control than you'd need with a turbo, and if you want to retain those factory O2 sensors and run in closed loop, then a supercharger might be for you. And Nitrous might be for you if you're on a relatively tight budget, you don't have a whole bunch to spend, and you want something that's cheap and fairly quick and simple to install. And you get to retain those factory O2 sensors, so you've got your closed loop operation, and you're okay with the extra wear and tear that Nitrous could put on your engine internals, or you're willing to run one of those progressive Nitrous installers that ramps it in gradually. And if you're willing to pay every weekend to get that bottle refilled and realize that when the bottle's empty, the fun's done, then Nitrous might be for you. So where I stand is I'm still in the turbo camp, as you guys can see. I still want that maximum bang for buck, maximum horsepower I can get for minimum amount of dollars. I'm okay with changing my oil a little more often, and I'm okay with picking up the laptop a little more often. So I'm sticking with turbocharging. I do want to get a Holley system in the not too distant future. That closed loop operation, especially at wide open throttle, is a pretty big selling feature for me, so it's definitely high on my wish list. But that being said, if I did have some extra money, I'd sure love to have a supercharged street vehicle. So that is on my wish list as well. Probably not in the immediate future, but who knows, if the channel does well and we start bringing in some extra income and I've got a little extra money to spend, I'd sure like to go with a ProCharger or a TorqueStorm supercharger. And I am still really tempted to give the Nitrous thing a try. It's definitely, like I said, I've never had a Nitrous vehicle and never experimented with it, so it's something I want to learn about and experiment with. So kind of tossing around the idea of buying a truck similar to mine, like a Gen 3 5.3 or 4.8, and putting a cam and springs in it and upgrading the transmission a little bit with like servos and what do they call it, like the Sonax boost control valve that gives you a little more line pressure, and a shift kit, and then see how much nitrous that thing will take. So I know Robert at Bad Luck Garage is kind of doing something similar with his Chaos Theory project. He's before he puts the turbo on, he says it's going to be a nitrous motor first, and he's going to see how much nitrous he can throw at it. So that'll be pretty entertaining to watch, and I'd kind of like to do something similar myself. So I think that will be in the not too distant future in the channel. Definitely before a supercharged vehicle, but it's a fun, should be a fun experiment. So that's going to be it for this week. Make sure to give us a follow on Instagram, LowBuckLS. You can find us on Facebook at LowBuckLS. Come join our Facebook group. I'll put a link in the description or the show notes. Subscribe to our podcast if you haven't already. Like I said, it's up on Spotify. It should be up on Apple soon, and I'm going to submit it to Google Podcasts and stuff as well. So thanks again for listening. We'll talk to you all again next week. Bye for now.